Hi there. This is my long form, audio only, full podcast reviewing the top TV shows of 2024. Now, if you haven't seen the first video, the way I did this was at the end of my really long 10-page script. I listed everything and made up little categories for best adaptation, best drama, that kind of thing. And I realized I buried the lead on that, so I recorded that first out of sequence. It was only 24 minutes to give it more focus. This is the long form audio only. Think of it as a live stream. I don't really do things live, but I do long form podcasts. It's meant to be audio only. I keep stressing that because put this long thing on in the background while you're doing other things. I know it's hard to watch really long things, but it is a whole year I'm reviewing. I already gave what I thought the top shows were, and like I said, because of the difficulty of categories, I'm just going chronologically. I'm not giving a number ranking. And I said if I had to pick one between Shogun and Penguin as show of the year, I would narrowly pick Penguin just because it's a lot more accessible and it's more recent. And again, because the Emmy cutoff is in May, technically they would never go head to head with each other. But then the Golden Globes last week go by calendar years. They did. I already talked about all of this. On top of that, I'm not trying to reach an arbitrary number. As it happens, I got 15 things because I counted Hazbin Hotel and Hell of a Boss are in the same fictional universe, so I just counted those as one thing to get 15. I'm not always going to do 15, it's just it happened to be roughly that much this year. Would that we had 20 really good shows in a year, but there's only so many. So the idea with this is I'm just reading off my longer, like third to a half of a page thoughts on each one of the entries I gave, because I haven't made specific reviews for all of these. First and foremost, Shogun. No one really anticipated. I mean, I had heard, they're making a Shogun adaptation. I wonder if it'll be any good. Because Shogun was a book before this that had a famous miniseries adaptation in the 80s. And that was like one of the first big miniseries. I mean, think before cable was even that big. Late 70s, early 80s, when you had miniseries that literally everyone in the country watched, like the original Roots with LeVar Burton, or the original Shogun, that this was part of the cultural zeitgeist. This was Super Bowl levels because everyone watched it. That's never going to come again. I mean, since the 90s, that's been impossible. Just there were only so many channels back then. But how can you make a new adaptation of Shogun? Well, Shogun was an adaptation in the first place, but this had so much impact, combined with the fact that Spring was relatively light. It had little competition. I mean, it would have been a great show, top one or two shows of the year, depending on your opinion. Regardless, because it was really that good. Even if it came out like last month, it would have been great. But there was no competition in Spring because of the aftermath of the writer's strike. First half of the year was a fallow time where I'm singling out the handful of shows that were really good, like Shogun, Fallout. Otherwise, in terms of consistency, we weren't getting a lot of programming first half of the year. And I've divided this loosely. My time periods are fall, summer, and spring of how we're going through everything here. Spring, there wasn't really that much. But it was amazing. Once every couple of years, you get a show like this, and it had no competition, so everyone saw it, even though, a lot of it is in Japanese and subtitle, and that's how it's different from the original Shogun, which didn't use subtitles for a lot of things. They used a translator and stuff that they really, I don't just want to say played around with. They were really innovative with using the language barrier and cultural barrier as a storytelling device. And that, well, there's a translator, but she's tactfully translating what he said. And with the subtitles back and forth and everything. And Shogun is loosely based on real events. I mean, William Adams was a real person. I mean, obviously, this is heavily fictionalized. But like the Battle of Sekigahara, which they talk about at the end, that was real. So it's a highly fictionalized. It gets the spirit of what happened right, if not the letter of what happened. You remember the Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai? That wasn't the letter of what happened, but it is in the spirit of what happened, that there was a samurai rebellion at the end of the Meiji Restoration against their own people. They felt abandoning their culture, and that they chose to die as the men they were, and to the vows of honor they kept rather than fade away into history. That it got the spirit of what happened right, even if it was, it was fictionalized. But you could say that of how many medieval movies. Like, Braveheart is a great movie, but historians are tearing their hair out because that isn't what actually happened. But it's still, well, it's in the spirit of everything. But no, this is even closer. So, Shogun was great. It would have been great no matter when it came out, but at the time it came out, it deservedly swept the Golden Globes 2 days ago from when I'm recording this. I don't know if the next seasons will be very good. They said they have at least 2 more seasons, and given that it's cribbing from real-life history, you could just keep going, even though there's only one book, and you can borrow elements from other books of that author, and it will show the Battle of Sekigahara and other stuff. But so much of what made season 1 was Anna Sawai's character and that doomed romance. I don't know. Even if seasons 2 and 3 are only half as good as the first season, they'd still be worth it. Because it's that good. And I think part of this is that, well, we didn't want to be pigeonholed as a miniseries. We wanted to win the prestigious main categories at the Emmys and the Golden Globes. And fair enough, even Penguin is also thinking of, let's make more seasons and maybe count it differently, but I don't think anything can surpass season 1, but even if you're only half as good as season 1, it would still be worth watching. So I'm happy that people were enjoying this. I'm also happy that, like, reactor channels I watch at, like, Japanese anime reactor channels actually got into watching this as well. We watch anime, this is a samurai drama, it's loosely based on real events and it's live action, but I pleasantly realized, there's a good deal of overlap, so it would appeal to a lot of people by then, which is pretty good. Fallout by Amazon. Now, Shogun was FX, that's technically Hulu, which is technically Disney. Fallout was Amazon. Also in this, I'm going to be ranking how each of the major streamers did this year, more in part 2 where I go over what's coming in 2025. Long story short, I barely watched anything on Netflix this year. They have not had a good year of original programming, even though allegedly their repurposed programming is doing so well financially, but I'm pleasantly surprised that, Amazon, for all its faults, is putting out shows I actually watch, like Fallout. I loved the original game. So when I say I love the games, I loved the desolate feel of the old school isometric Fallout 1, Fallout 2, and yes, I loved Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel, fighting the calculator in the Midwest. I know you say it's not canon, it's basically canon. I digress. Point is, I love the world of Fallout. I loved the dark humor it had. This whole idea of, we'll make an RPG at the time, late 90s, which wasn't fantasy or magic, but had substitutes for fantasy or magic with sci-fi. That, well, we have ray guns instead of fireballs. Instead of elves, we have mutated ghouls. And just that they matched up the tropes of a fantasy RPG to a post-apocalyptic RPG, and it still basically worked. Walter Goggins was firing on all cylinders as the ghoul. This could have been a paycheck. Instead, he took the role very seriously. This is probably one of the best roles he's ever done, and he's a major actor. And he was doing it over a ton of prosthetics. So his acting was great, this was really the year of Ella Purnell. That she was in not one but 2 big video game adaptations. She was the star of Fallout, and she was the voice of Jinx in Arcane. And on top of that, she'll soon be in Yellow Jackets Season 3, so it's great time for Purnell fans. But just the post-apocalyptic, they call it Z-Rust, the retro-futuristic setting. I just love the tropes of that. The cast was great. I liked seeing the Brotherhood of Steel. You can't really have a Fallout project without the Brotherhood of Steel, because no, they are the hope for the wasteland, that they are rebuilding America, and that they're keeping the dream of civilization alive. Again, from a man who really loved Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel from their perspective, and not the bloated and corrupt New California Republic. But you know what I mean. In terms of adaptation, I talked about this in the other video, this Fallout show wasn't actually a direct adaptation of a specific video game narrative. It's like this could have been a video game narrative. They turned it into a TV show, which is a compliment, that it feels like it could have been part of the games. This is probably one of top 5 in that you could mention on one hand the best video game adaptations in the past decade or so. And Yes, some will say The Last of Us Season 1 was better. I'm not arguing that. But Fallout faced a more difficult challenge. Because The Last of Us was a direct adaptation of a pre-established storyline. It is a straight-up adaptation of a storyline. You could argue it's a better adaptation because it was presenting a real storyline from a thing, versus it's harder to make up your own category. And I know in the last video I said, well, Fallout and Penguin didn't adapt something specific, but X-Men 97 was a specific storyline. I know I'm coming at it from both sides, I'm sorry, but it's just, which is more difficult? Very faithfully adapting a specific storyline from a book or a TV show and getting it right, or having very little source material and having to do the extra work of coming up with it on your own, like House of the Dragon and Rings of Power don't have a lot of source material to draw on. So I accept that the writers faced a more difficult task. Versus if you're doing a straight-up literary adaptation or video game adaptation, there's more scrutiny, so it's harder because people are comparing it line by line to the source. But on top of that, adapting a world is another thing. That Last of Us, it has a realistic setting. I mean, it's a post-apocalypse, so there's this fungal zombie apocalypse, so other than the monster designs, the atmosphere, that was a big part of the games too, that it got the atmosphere of like that TV show Life After People, that just not nuked or anything, it's just the cities that have been abandoned for 20 years, which have been reclaimed by nature and stuff. That does involve a lot of set dressing, wear and tear, and I'm not knocking on that. But there are reasonable models for what a decayed city looks like, versus Fallout also had to be post-apocalyptic and have all these retro sci-fi future designs, like a rusty sapient android, or for the Docbots, or for the ray guns, literally, or the Brotherhood of Steel suits they actually built practically. So, in terms of the costume designing and the mutant designs, which they had to come up with some of these or match, in terms of world building, Fallout had to do a lot more. So I would at least mention it in the same sentence. If you're making a short list of the best video game adaptations of the past decade, I'd put Fallout next to The Last of Us Season 1. And we'll see where they go from there. I was not expecting it to be that good. I wasn't surprised it was that good. Just, you never know on a new project, but I trust the Fallout series, and it was really nice. Biggest surprise of the year came later, but for Fallout, this was really good. Sorry, just a big Fallout fan. Next, we get to, in my rambling podcast here, again, this is supposed to be longer than the other one. Then we got X-Men 97. This is just, what more can I add? This is a dream come true. That they would straight up make a continuation of the classic X-Men 90 series that to an entire generation, including myself, really codified the prior 30 years of comic storylines. Codified and streamlined, and okay, this is presented more coherently in one big burst. This is what these storylines are. And it's not just inspired by the 90s show. There was a pretty good adaptation, a summation of these storylines that they continue it like that and fit it in seamlessly. It's covering Operation Zero Tolerance, the Prime Sentinels. We do not deserve something this good. And that they get back most of the original voice cast, like the original Rogue. Just X-Men 97 deserves to be set on a pedestal. The only blemish on all this is the behind-the-scenes drama, which I am not in a position to comment on. Others know more than me. I really don't know what to think of. Just, we know the second season is done already, or the storylines were. But the behind-the-scenes drama with it, like the week before it premiered, they fired the head writer, DeMeo. And I'm not really sure what objectively happened. They said it was harassment. I don't know. He has his own claims. Otherwise, I wasn't there. And it's upsetting that situation had to come up on what was otherwise a triumph for the comic book community. And it left me terrified for the stake of future seasons, though maybe it'll be different under different writers, we'll have to see. But even if the later seasons aren't good at all, which at least season 2 I think will be coherent, season 1 in isolation, regardless of what happens after this, you could have even ended the show with this. You could have not made more seasons. And this would still be this perfect follow-up, just going and the adventure continues for that continuity of the X-Men. Okay, one other minor, not really a complaint. It's given the amount of time they had, and there are future seasons, so this isn't really a complaint. My one other caveat is this is a wish list thing. I thought it was really daring that they actually kept Madeline Pryor alive at the end of the Goblin Queen story, only to then leave it coy whether or not she survived the Genosha massacre. At first, I was like, whoa, they didn't kill off Madeline Pryor. In other sci-fi, it's always the status quo is God thing, that whenever there's a clone or a duplicate, one or the other ends up getting killed. But no, now we have, that's a lot more interesting, is the existential horror of we have this perfect Jean Grey clone who is functionally her twin sister, but with all of her memories downloaded that aren't hers, who for months was living with the X-Men, had a baby with Cyclops, even though it's genetically equivalent to genes, and just, oh, no, she's the clone now, we have to turn on her, and just, no, she is Jean, she thinks she is, she has her memories. And that how hurt she is, and just you feel sorry for her, and just being on her own, and she had to go to Genosha and everything. So I was really proud of that at first, that they kept Madeline Pryor around. Only to then hint we might be killing her off, but then they make it a point to say, no one ever really dies in the comics, but they even say, well, we never found a body. So I thought it would be more interesting. This is why in Spider-Man comics, even after the horrors of the Clone Saga dragging on in the 90s, with a revolving door of writers, Ben Reilly is still a popular character, the Peter Parker clone who found out he was the clone. That Madeline Pryor is the X-Men's Ben Reilly. And I just feel so sorry for her that, it would be cruel to kill her off like that, and it's more interesting to have this other Jean Grey level person around. But then again, they made a point to say, well, we're not sure if she died, and they're getting another season, so that's more of a wish list for season 2 than a knock on season 1. That's my one thing. I've used Madeline Pryor more. Don't just waste the potential of this interesting of a character. And the inter-character drama between the love triangle between her, Jean, and Cyclops, always good. Also back at the start of 2024 was another big animated release. And I don't like separating animation out from live action. A story is a story. Hazbin Hotel on Amazon. I know that might sound like a weird choice, but in terms of fandom, just the thought that went into this, that also, it started out as indie animation. It was an indie project on YouTube. The pilot came out in 2019, and they just kept saying, we're going to work on getting this into being a major released show. And they started out with this other spin-off called Hell of a Boss, which I counted these as one category this year. Just, if I had to reduce top 16 to top 15, Hell of a Boss Season 2, because it's made by the same people, and it's in a different part of Hell in the same animated continuity, but this is probably you can tell that the creator outright said huge influences on me were Steven Universe and Invader Zim. That this show feels like the bastard child of Steven Universe crossed with Invader Zim. I mean, the story is literally, what if Satan's daughter was this optimistic Disney princess of hell who breaks out into musical numbers all the time? And it works because it's so insane. But not in a mean-spirited way. It's this Don Quixote-like, really optimistic, nice person in the face of all these problems, and it's on her side, that it's not taking this cynically. So in terms of the characterization, the storytelling, and that there were little hints since the pilot, which if you pay attention, the type of show that rewards paying attention in fan theories, as opposed to, oh, let's have the fans have their stupid theories, that no, the theories usually do pay off. Maybe not exactly as you thought they would, but the hints do go somewhere. This isn't J.J. Abrams' the mystery box type thing anymore. I hate it when they do it. No, when they put in a mystery, they usually solve it by the end of the season, of the character reveals and stuff. So, in and of itself, this was great production-wise, but on top of that it was an indie project, and consider that. This was an outsider thing, at a time when the studio system with the writers was at the top of the strike. Well, it was January by then, the strikes had ended, but this spring was dominated by a production slump that all the things we would have been writing for spring, we couldn't because there was a strike, so there weren't even that many shows out, because the studio system is really broken and they weren't paying the writers enough or having enough writers to make a project good. They were just churning out crap. Versus this indie animator had a pretty innovative new idea that beat the system and got on into Amazon as this wide-scale release. So in terms of fandom and fan creations and outsider creators, this was a triumph. Moving on from that chronologically, this is the last of the spring season of 2024 of things we were watching that were good. More of an honorable mention because, a miniseries may or may not count, but True Detective Night Country. I really enjoyed watching that, even though it was kind of formulaic, but it's not that kind of show where the lore was just there. It's how they did it, that the cast was really good with Jodie Foster and new ones like Royce. Finn Bennett, the younger deputy in that, he's going to be Arian Brightflame in Dunk and Egg, and so I know him from that now. But the cast was all great, both the veterans and the new ones. And it wasn't really a lore kind of story. It's scary in that sense, or jump scares. Just, I like that they hired this, Lopez, she was this Mexican horror movie director, and treated it as just this long-form horror movie. That, because Issa Lopez was, a real movie director, that this has real movie-level cinematography and lighting and pacing and just the moodiness of it. And with the music on top of that, and yeah, it's the trope of the mysterious Antarctic, in this case the Arctic, and yeah, there's obviously homages to The Thing and stuff in that. John Carpenter's The Thing and everything, but the creepiness of how Arctic light works, and I looked at the behind the scenes thing to explain, they had to get the lighting right, so the colors are washed out and all this thing, so as a cinema fan, it was an experience to watch as a mood with creepy imagery, even if the story was kind of light. It was just this scary mood watching it. Like, I just watched the Nosferatu movie from Eggers over Christmas break, and similarly, yeah, the story's just kind of a generic vampire story, but it's just so well filmed and acted. I still really enjoyed it. So it's kind of like that with True Detective Night Country. Again, it helps that very little else was out in spring. And the measure is, did I enjoy it? The answer is yes. That had this come out at the height of fall, when we have all these other shows, I wouldn't be talking about it that much. But at a time when we were desperate for good content, like Jodie Foster hasn't done TV projects in forever. And she rightfully won the Golden Globe this past weekend for it, and the Emmys and stuff, because it was a good performance. So, I hope they actually pick up more of the lore stuff with the Lovecraftian things, but I enjoyed True Detective Season 4. Now we get to summer season, which is really the meat of this. Even though there aren't as many shows in it, they were the bigger shows. The only reason my comments will be comparatively brief is because I've already done other videos on these things. House of the Dragon Season 2, Lord of the Rings Season 2, and The Boys Season 4. Those were the three things we were watching in summer. I didn't really see The Boys Season 4 due to time constraints, so I don't have much to say, but like Red Team Review and others have really liked it. The fan reaction was very positive, so I'm listing here as I trust that they said this is one of the best shows of the year, and the clips I've seen from it, and I'm spoiled, were pretty good. The only issue is that Season 5 will be their final season, and probably should be the final season rather than drag out this story forever. They've had a good run. 5 seasons is a good run these days. And they said, well, our plan is to have spin-offs with other characters in the same tone, in the same universe, like Gen V, maybe other spin-offs. We'll see how they fare. Because the whole thing was, the story of the main show was just so good. I did like Season 1 a lot. I just haven't had time to catch up. I love their whole satire of corporate culture and corporate-backed celebrity culture, that the main thing of the public image of Homelander is very different from the actual person, that like real celebrities and corporations and corporate leaders and politicians, he has a dedicated PR team that puts a spin on things, or that people are obsessed with Homelander's Twitter feed when he doesn't even write his own Twitter feed. He has a PR team to do that. This is just great satire, so I love that. And very briefly, because I've talked about it so much elsewhere, I would still include House of the Dragon Season 2 in a list of the top 15 TV shows of the year. Because intellectually I understand that there were behind-the-scenes problems due to the strike that weren't their fault. This double blow of not being allowed to do live rewrites, and at the last minute having their episode budget cut, we know how that affected them. All the other critics I've seen say, well, we wouldn't put it near the top of the top 10, but like number 7 or 8, because we still enjoyed watching it. It's just I'm more worried about the next seasons than I was worried about season 2 itself. And yeah, it would have been a little more refined and a little bit better timing and pacing had they been able to do live rewrites. I mean, specific channels I can list off, like Red Team Review, Preston, well, maybe not Preston, but Alt Shift X, Glidus, Supercuts Delight, to name a few, all have said we understand that there were external factors that we don't blame the writers for so far. Maybe Martin is fighting with them over other things, but they haven't happened yet, so we can't really judge. What is Martin upset about? He said it wasn't things from season 2, it was things coming in the next seasons, which I hope, just hope, are, stemming from episode cuts, that if they get 10 episode seasons again, he'll be able to add more stuff back. We'll have to see. That is the question of the moment, but again, as these other channels have said, episode 2 of season 2, Rhaenyra the Cruel, isn't just arguably the best episode of this TV show, but possibly the best of this entire franchise. Easily top 5. I mean, we could debate that, but people are saying it was clearly the best of the season, and genuinely arguing it's better than episode 8 of season 1, with when Vaemon Velaryon gets decapitated and everything. That brought together all of season 1. I like the argument I've seen others put forward that the deciding factor that makes Rhaenyra the Cruel better is that technically everything in Lord of the Tides, episode 8, was one storyline that every character was in King's Landing. Whereas Rhaenyra the Cruel had to do the more difficult task of juggling 2 storylines at least, that this is what King's Landing is doing and this is how Dragonstone is reacting. Covering multiple concurrent storylines is harder, so yeah, that would give it more points to me. The other thing, though, is you see so many top 10 lists predictably putting the battle episodes at the very top. Now, let me be clear, I liked episode 4 with Battle of Rook's Rest. It was a very well done, emotional battle, both logistically and because it was following character beats. And on top of that, the other storylines of the episode were good too. Like, we got the whole, this is when Oscar Tully was introduced in Daemon's storyline. So overall, Daemon was good in it, Rhaenyra was good in it, the big part was the battle scene. But there were better drama scenes in episode 2. But everyone always puts, no, it's gotta be dragon action. Like these other reviewers, I'm insulted that there were people in comments saying episode 2 was outright boring. There weren't any dragon battles. Like, for God's sake, the Cargill Bowl at the end of episode 2 was an amazing duel scene. I'm just saying, not just a duel scene. I thought it'd be perfunctory when I knew they were going to do it. But actually seeing the pacing and emotion and the artwork that went into making that duel blew me away. And it didn't need to have a dragon in it. So how could people say nothing happened when it ended with this epic Cargill Bowl? So I've talked about all this more elsewhere, that yeah, it was an uneven season. There were pacing problems by the back half, which probably would have been trimmed if they'd been allowed to do rewrites. But Rhaenyra the Cruel, when they do episode by episode nominations for writers and directors, Claire Kilner and Sarah Hess should win Emmys at the next Emmys for Rhaenyra the Cruel, more than any other episode, because they were the writer-director team on that. Rounding out the list here, though, I know this would, I said before, I honestly thought Lord of the Rings Season 2 head-to-head was better than House of the Dragon Season 2 if you're basing this on internal consistency. Recognizing there were external problems in the other one, that relative to itself, that it had a beginning, middle, end, that relative to the first season, Rings of Power Season 2 was so much better. All reviewers agree it was drastically better. And we later found out, they admitted in the post-season interviews what happened, that we suspected, that they started making this like 2019 or earlier. So when they wrote this, it was before the pandemic. Back then, remember, everyone was using the binge model. Remember just how much TV changed when they thought, oh, the binge model's going to be the thing and weekly recaps are going to die out. Well, no, that's bad for business. That's bad for generating hype. And they all realized this to the point that even Amazon released The Boys Season 1 all at once, binge model. By Season 2, they had shifted to episodic. And unfortunately, this shift happened between when they wrote Lord of the Rings Season 1 and when they actually aired it. Because they aired it episodically, but the writers have subsequently said, we thought people would watch that in one afternoon, 1 8-hour stretch. So the mysteries in it weren't enough to sustain 2 months of theorization, but they were never intended to. Like, who is the stranger, or who is this Halbrand guy? Like, they never really meant it to be that way, or the pacing was really slow. Well, because it was supposed to be like early Lord of the Rings, where they're just getting used to everything and the slow beauty of it. And you can do that in an afternoon's show that ends with a battle. You can't do that week to week, because it made the first half very boring for like a month before they got to what they were really doing. So it was uneven. Tonally, they were trying too hard to be Game of Thrones. Season 2 was trying to tonally be Lord of the Rings more than it was trying to be Game of Thrones. The characters, they weren't overhyping Galadriel as I'm this badass woman anymore. And Galadriel is a woman who is a warrior. That is in Silmarillion. I don't question that. It's just they made her a little too argumentative to try to show she was assertive when she was in Numenor. And this was a disservice to the actress, who actually did a really good job. And it's like that one, there were 4 storylines. That 1/4 of the series just felt off. And I felt like, and there may be true, that there may have been orders from higher up the corporate ladder, make her our face of the show, make Galadriel our Game of Thronesy person and girl boss, and they tried too hard. Where there are other episodes, even in season 1, like the first episode, Galadriel is fine, that she's a warrior and is tough, but isn't angry at people. Then again, they have a character arc for her. The whole point is she starts out angry, then grows in wisdom as she goes through tragedy and loss. Season 2 showed that a lot better, that by the beginning she's angry and doing things through the crucible of everything that happens. By the end, she's grown in wisdom. That I hate it when people just go, oh, they ruined this character, not in this, but in other shows. Guys, there's a character arc. They're starting out as that. They can grow into something else. Even so, season 1 needed refinement. They had overhyped it. Then they tried to turn it into their Game of Thrones. Season 2 was written knowing it would be released episodically. So it was paced episodically. Every episode had a conclusion as part of a whole, but instead of just, we thought it'd all be one really long movie cut up into 8 parts, but binged one afternoon anyway. So I'm sorry I'm rambling here, but season 2 was, you could tell this was written to be episodic. That was probably the biggest and most obvious problem with season 1. And just tonally, they dialed back some of the parts that weren't working, dialed up the other ones. That the weakest part of the show to me is, and this isn't a weakness, they made an adaptation choice that lets show Numenor as contemporary to all of this. Whereas if they did it the way the book did it, there would be time skips on the scale of centuries between different generations of Numenorians. They're like, when the war with Sauron began, Elendil wasn't alive. Ar-Pharazôn wasn't alive. And I can see how reasonable men would differ on this. That for the purposes of a TV show, they wanted to condense the timeline so Elendil and Ar-Pharazôn's generation are all there. And granted, Numenorians can live to be like 200. But it means you have to condense the timeline more. And I can see why they did. It is, for the sake of the writers, it's a challenge they faced. And the cast members they got were really good. Also in season 2, the Numenorians started actually, while the Numenorian storyline was weak overall, because it was on the back burner, by the end they were starting to do things I'd hoped for from the beginning, such as really showing that the faithful, the minority of them who are still faithful to the elves and the Valar, are being persecuted like Christians in Rome, is a big thing Tolkien did in the backstory, and that Elendil is basically Noah. The righteous man is surrounded by his enemies in a decadent court. And that in the season 2 finale left me really hopeful. The storyline I wanted to show was the Numenorians start dominating their outposts on the coasts. They have these big forts. I'm going to make a whole video about this. There's evocative imagery Tolkien has that the Numenorians come back to Middle-earth. They establish these ports as outposts to expand their domination. At first to establish protectorates, but eventually just to dominate everyone. Like Pelargir, which they actually showed Pelargir in season 2, and ended with saying, hey, we're going to start taxing everyone here to bolster the Numenorian military. That's a storyline from the book they're actually touching on now. So the Numenorian stuff was backburnered, a little condensed. I wouldn't say it was bad, but they were advancing it by the end of the season, so fair enough. It was better than season 1, even though season 1 had better pacing on that. they didn't know what they were doing. So inherent with, do you have time skips or not? That isn't an easy question, but overall, and the battle scene they had was pretty well done for what it was doing. This is finally when Sauron was interesting. I did not like the Sauron storyline in season 1, but then again, they said we never intended it for it to be a mystery dragged out over eight weeks. It was meant to be all one sitting. I forgive that now. I see what went wrong. But Sauron, I'm going to make all these other videos on this. If you haven't been watching this, skip to season 2, episode 5, which is just Sauron in his guise as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, seducing Celebrimbor with promises of, no, I'm an angel sent from heaven to guide you, and will make these rings of power. That is, if you showed that to someone out of context who hadn't seen the show anymore, they would have gone, this is straight up Tolkien. That they were approaching that in season 2. Not every episode. Particularly episode 5. That's pretty much what we were expecting. I'm going to make more videos about that. I am going to start getting back onto my backlog of Lord of the Rings reviews, because I felt bad I never got to it. But that's the end of the summer season, really, that extended into September. And I'll rush through this a bit more, because I'm going to review these on their own. Agatha All Along was a really good return to form for Marvel TV. I know the real return to form, because there are behind-the-scenes reforms in their production process. I've talked about that in my videos on this, are really supposed to kick in with Daredevil Born Again, but you could tell there were improvements behind the scenes on Agatha All Along. And I'm going to cover that, and I make other reviews for that because I was really watching it. It made me outright optimistic for future Marvel projects, and this was made by the same person that made WandaVision. And they said now we're thinking of it as a trilogy with with WandaVision, then Agatha All Along, and then Vision Quest will come up. I'm looking forward to that now. Speaking of which, on a related tangent, something which did not have necessary behind-the-scenes reforms at Disney+, whereas Marvel, you can tell they're fixing things. There are other big franchises, Star Wars, and for Star Wars on that front, this was decidedly not a good year. I'm not sure if The Acolyte necessarily deserves all of the criticism lobbed at the people behind the scenes on it, in the sense of, well, who was responsible for what exactly? Because it's usually a combination of people. That the toxic fanboys considered it an easy shot, but even by objective measure, I have to say there were problems with it. I'm not trying to pick a side. I'm just saying I need to research this more. I like researching something before I invest myself in condemning it. That, like a trial. It's not that I'm giving them a pass. It's not that I'm condemning. It's just I need to do more research to find out what the heck was going on in Acolyte. Because I haven't had the time to read everything. Of who did what exactly was going on that led to these decisions. Is this what they wanted to make? I don't know. So, I'm upset about this because I wanted them to make more stories set in the High Republic. That there's a whole different timeline of thousands of years. They could have said stuff during the High Republic when the Sith were just on the fringes, and what was it like? The most interesting parts of like the prequel trilogy are when you see the parts of Phantom Menace on like Coruscant, where this is what the galaxy used to be like before the fall of the Republic. That's interesting to me, fighting over, trade disputes and stuff. No, seriously, just with the Jedi at their height and what were they doing, it's just, I think of it like the Star Wars comics, where it doesn't need to be a grand story arc. It can be like episodically, and here's Qui-Gon solving a trade dispute on this planet. There's romance, there's love, there's duels and things, but like one-shot stories set during the High Republic. Stuff that Star Wars Visions did, is what I'm trying to say. Or it's just one-shot stories set in different eras, but maybe connect them. But the whole thing with the alternate chosen ones, I have to really assess what the heck they were doing on the Acolyte. I'm just saying it was not what it was supposed to be, and I will need to do more research. That is not in my top 10 list. I'm just mentioning it alongside Marvel turned a corner. Maybe Star Wars can in the future if Marvel did. But, yes, Andor Season 2 is coming, but that was, I have to assess what's coming. And, of course, not exactly paired with it, but coming out head-to-head with a Marvel project was a DC Comics project, The Penguin. I'm making separate video reviews about this, so I'll keep it short here. I don't see it as a rivalry, like I said, because, again, different genres. Light comedy, specifically dealing with magic in the form of actual witches, versus hyper-realistic Penguin. yes, Penguin is the better show, but Agatha was never even trying to compete against it. It was what it was. So I don't think they are comparable. I mean, one's a comedy, one's a drama. And I do think the top two shows were Shogun or Penguin, and Penguin is narrowly better than Shogun just in terms of what it achieved, but in terms of the cinematography and everything and the film noir aspects, but that's down to personal preference. And arbitrary, because like I said, they're practically in different award cycles. If I had to choose, I'd choose Penguin. After that, and we got a pretty good string of hits since summer. Since House of the Dragon, we were kind of bummed out in August. But then there was Lord of the Rings, which overlapped with Agatha and Penguin, which overlapped with Dune. And then Creature Commandos. And now that Creature Commandos is ending, there isn't really a lot I'm going to watch coming up, but that's more for the 2025 video I'm making. But think about it, we've had a string of good shows since summer that are now going to end. And I'm not into what's coming out in spring that much until Daredevil comes in March. For the next 2 months, it's a bit of a fallow time. But right after Penguin, we got Dune Prophecy, which is officially my biggest positive surprise of the year. That if Acolyte was the negative surprise of the year, this was the positive surprise. That there were all sorts of delays since it was announced, different showrunners. I was not expecting this to be good at all. I thought this would even be an embarrassment. I was hoping it would at best be presentable. But it's one of those things, it's a lot like the Han Solo movie, where you can tell this had drastic rewrites that probably did make it a better film. That you can tell the original might not have been that good. That I was worried that the weakest episode of the season, 6 episodes, was episode 2, was a bit clunky. I thought the whole season would at best be like that, and probably worse in other episodes. And instead, no, that was like a B. The rest of the season was an A. And maybe not an A+ all the time, but it turned out to be the perfect supplement to the Villeneuve movies. Because that was my one complaint about Dune Part 2, is I thought they do a lot more world-building explanation on why aren't there computers or robots? And this tackled it head on. Well, there was this robot revolt we actually see briefly at the beginning of the Machine Crusades. And then we see... They never really got into too much what taking the water of life and accessing your genetic memory implies. That if you have years of training, you can handle it and become a Reverend Mother. But if you make someone who isn't well-trained or just a newbie acolyte try to do it when they're not ready, your ancestral memories, which are their own personalities, can overwhelm you and take over your body, becoming abomination. And that new actress they got playing Lila, the one who goes through it, where she shifts from playing her grandmother, who's this wise leader of the order, to her vindictive, her grandmother's grandmother is the founder, then her grandmother Dorothea, who's vindictive. This one actress playing multiple roles like that. I am going to make a separate review about this, so I'm going to do it more coherently then. I'm just rambling now. She was great. I mean, I loved Emily Watson, since she was in Chernobyl and other projects. She knocked it out of the park. Just as I've said in other things, the A plot was A level. When you're watching the parts with the sisterhood, this is like movie quality. And when you watch it, you realize the stuff with like the Carino Emperor and stuff is a B plot, and it's about as good as a good B plot in a good way. I mean, it does what it's trying to do. It's not even a weakness. And even the stuff with, like the younger cast members, the star-crossed romance of Kieran Atreides and the other stuff, that works, where it's not even that big of a focus of the show, so it's good for what it is, and hopefully it'll grow into something else. But this was a great lore supplement for why don't they have robots, genetic memory. This is the first time that Villeneuve's movies never mentioned the Ixians or the Tleilaxu. And we got the start of all the Ixians are bucking the trend on the AI ban, and the Tleilaxu are fiends. They are genetic scientists. They're a race of Frankenstein's monsters. They're evil. They're amoral, not just immoral, amoral. They have no morality. They're monsters. And but the girl playing her nice. The Tleilaxu are repugnant to me. They terrify you. So, but they introduced those. They introduced that. Okay, this is what the Carino Empire is like a bit more. We never actually saw the Landsrod. And it was really cool that they actually had like a full flashback episode 3, where most of the show is on Wallach 9 or Seleucus Secundus, But then they have this whole episode that's a field trip to the original Harkonnen homeworld, Lankaville, plus the Atreides on Caladan. And I've seen the nice comparisons, positive comparisons to House of the Dragon Season 1, that the two female leads, in this case sisters, have time skips where they're played by younger actors, and they're pretty good. With young Valia and young Tula. That was actually pretty nice. And seeing the whale fur, I mean, this is heavy lore stuff that you know that book fans made this. And just the cinematography and everything. Well, the cinematography isn't the best I've ever seen, but it was pleasant. Like compared to like Penguin, where it felt like art house movie level stuff. And they said they were copying the French Connection and everything. Just in terms of the set design and costuming and lore stuff, this surprisingly felt really like Dune. And it's a short season, but it left me, again, okay, this was a trial. It had some rough starts in production, but I am now actively looking forward to the next season and other spin-offs. I didn't think I'd be... Is this what it feels like having nice things? That we actually got, like, a good Dune TV show, a good X-Men 97. Marvel and a Marvel show was actually pretty good for once after 2 years with Agatha, and The Penguin was better than we thought it would be, and Lord of the Rings was better than we thought it would be. House of the Dragon, I do feel, had problems because of the strike, but not because, oh, we hired a moron. We hired some untrained person or some outsider who will bring in new ideas to the Acolyte without vetting them first. Again, I have to research that more, but that's why this is on the list of the best shows of the year. These things turned out well. Which was the bigger surprise between Dune Prophecy and Rings of Power? Dune Prophecy was the surprise of the year because Rings of Power, I could tell watching season 1, even though people were really laying into it, because it's held up to a higher standard. It's goddamn Lord of the Rings. You could tell, I suspected it's because it was meant to be in a binge model, and they later admitted that after season 2, that season 1 was meant to be in a binge model, stupidly released it episodically. That wasn't their fault. And just little tweaks here and there they needed to refine. That when I actually saw it, I walked into it thinking I'd hate it when I saw the first trailer. Then I read the interviews and I went, I can see what you're trying to do. Let's see how it measures. I had a measured response reviewing it going, I see potential here if you can improve on yourself and refine your weaknesses. I don't know if they did that fully in season 2, but they made significant progress. But even watching season 1, I went, I can see this going somewhere, because season 1 was a known quantity, versus Dune Prophecy was the first season of a show we had no idea to judge what it would be like. So that's why season 1 is always a bigger surprise of any show. Even season 1 of a bad show, you kind of get a sense of, well, these are things they might play around with next season. Dune Prophecy, I really was not expecting people to be... For me to be enjoying this, and for, like, the reactor community to really embrace it, the Dune fandom, like, Alt-Shift-X having crossovers with Quinn's ideas, going over and gleefully talking about all 6 episodes for, like, 2 hours a night after every one. And that fan channels were really actually going over that it wasn't a cash grab. Well, they're all cash grabs in their way, but that they treated the lore seriously and had things we could actually discuss without criticizing, hating on at least. And that it fueled online discussion. I was not expecting this to be a new franchise thing, and I'm happy it was. The remaining shows on my list here all happen to be animation, but that's just a coincidence, just chronologically. Others have already said a lot more about Arcane Season 2 than I can, so I'm very quickly going to say that I agree with the general consensus I've seen that Season 2 was marginally not quite as good as Season 1, if only because Season 1 set up so many great subplots in motion that Season 2 had to juggle them all, which is hard. And it's a measure of how good something is if your main complaint is you want more on every front. They had to stuff a lot of subplots into Season 2, but in a good way. I'm interested in all these characters now that I didn't think I'd be when I started. And there won't be a Season 3 of Arcane as such, they said. That there are going to be other spin-offs in the League of Legends universe, which these characters might individually cross into again. But the story of the Arcane, Seasons 1 and 2, with Jinx and everything, that wrapped, I hope to see these characters again. They don't just, like, randomly kill off the main pairing with vying and Kate in the next. I don't want them to, let's kill off those characters because no one gets a happy ending. Maybe they should, but there will be other things in that franchise, they said, and it won't be soon because it takes so long to animate, but overall a success. had to fit in a lot more. That's not a complaint, really, and nothing can match the impact of the first season, where no one was expecting this new animation style, the tonally, the differences it had. It was this gritty, arguably urban fantasy, because it's dealing with, like, social unrest and stratification and income inequality. So season 1 blew us all away. Season 2 is a worthy follow-up, but I'm interested in doing other inventive things in the League of Legends verse eventually. And chronologically very last was DC Comics' Creature Commandos. I was not expecting this to be this mind-blowingly good. I mean, this would be a great movie. And they said, like, they even argued, why didn't you, because it's only 7 episodes, why didn't you just release this as a live-action movie all at once? Because the writing is that good. And James Gunn did defend, well, episodic versus binge model. We wanted to create a discussion each week, combined with the story is kind of episodic, that every half hour is covering the backstory of one of the different characters in turn. Makes sense. Like, last episode finally got around to Dr. Phosphorus's backstory, is really good too. They're all really good. But I realized also, why didn't they just binge dump this animated thing? Well, it made more sense to space it out. I have been greatly enjoying it. I would list it among the top 4 or 5 shows of the year in terms of storytelling quality. Even though it came out so late, it spilled over into January. I have nothing but praise for this. I have relatives who over the holidays said, I've been so burned by DC Comics over the past decade, I'm not going to get into the new Superman movie whose trailer just came out. I'm not even going to watch Creature Commandos. I'm like, it's James Gunn who did Guardians of the Galaxy. He's a good writer. And it's a reboot. It's an entirely new set of people at the helm. At least try it out to see how the new DC reboot, once in a decade reboot, is going to do. Of how they'll handle everything. But this Creature Commandos left me feeling very optimistic for the new James Gunn verse of DC Comics. I can't really add more than that. Another thing that was still ongoing and just rattling off, that was chronologically the last thing. I already talked about this in my other video. The Amazing Digital Circus is a web animation. It's an indie project, much as Hell of a Boss started out as an indie project. I think it's on streaming on Amazon now, I'm not sure. No, it's Netflix, I think. But it started out on YouTube. It's free on YouTube anyway. And if you haven't seen The Amazing Digital Circus, as a sci-fi fan, check it out. There's only like 4 episodes because they only come out once every 3 or 4 months, but it's the idea. It's inspired by Harlan Ellison's classic "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream." That there's this group of people who are trapped in a virtual reality circus with no memory of how they got there, other than I remember putting on a VR headset and now I've lost all my memories, and I'm trapped in this digital circus. And they're held prisoner by this AI named Kane, but rather than being psychotic like Am and I Have No Mouth, he's sort of a wacky P.T. Barnum, unaware of the harm he's doing. And the conceit of the show is that that they're all wearing actual VR headsets from today, so the show looks like a cheap 3D graphics metaverse. It looks like what a real-life VR headset today would look like. It's also a cost-saving thing. It doesn't need to look better than that. And there are fan theories that if, in a future episode, if someone actually takes their helmet off or we see the real world, wouldn't it be cool if it's live action? That we see it as cheap 3D animation as you might see in a VR metaverse headset, because we've never seen what the real-life equivalent looks like. It might not even be animated. That's pretty cool. But in terms of the sci-fi-ness, I've seen, like, apparently this is popular with younger kids and stuff. All the sci-fi references get over their heads. I mean, there's, like, on bookshelves, there's titles of existential Sartre books and stuff. And it's a lot about existentialism and purpose, and, like, NPCs who gain self-awareness, like in Westworld, actually happens in the Candy Kingdom. And there's the gummy crocodile who realizes it's basically a ripoff, riffing on Westworld of, oh dear God, I'm an NPC. My mother isn't real. I have no past. Who am I? And dealing with identity and morality and just, well, they have no past, but what are these people trapped in the circus going to do? Very philosophical, and just people are debating and all it. Analysis, I put things on my top lists also for does this fuel online discussion? So, like, a generic, it's a sitcom doesn't generate discussion versus, YouTube discussion channels are having a lot of fun analyzing Amazing Digital Circus because a lot of thought went into it. And the meta game, the meta level aspects of the meta commentary and how the fans are picking apart theories about it. If you haven't heard of this, there's only 4 episodes, marathon them. It's the next big thing everyone's really discussing. Like back in 2019, oh, there's this pilot for this interesting thing called Hazbin Hotel. Like more than that. And it's actually really dark at times. I can't believe it's actually kids don't understand what it's like when, like, this is really actually a horrifying concept. But it's deceptively cheerful, even though they're dealing with themes of existential dread. And sometimes there's jump scares in it. But it's just in terms of indie projects outside of the studio system, this is one of those success stories of this started out as an indie project and it's a really original writing, as opposed to yet another generic thing churned out by Netflix. Speaking of which, you can tell on my list, like, other than Arcane, which was a follow-up season to something else and animated, I haven't really enjoyed anything coming out on Netflix in the past year, nor am I looking forward to most of the things coming out in the coming year. I'll get to that in my video on shows in 2025. Oh, but lastly, the thing I also mentioned in my awards video that I started this with is I'm not always going to include documentaries in my best of year list, but like I would have included like the Firefest documentary or the Bad Blood documentary. Great documentary that came out beginning of the year. I didn't put it in the spring part just to emphasize it at the end here as a wrap up to the themes of what this year was. The documentary Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV came out beginning of this year and was an expose documentary on the toxic work environment at Nickelodeon the past 20 years under Dan Schneider, leading to his dismissal right before the pandemic. And even if it's taken as a given that he didn't do anything outright illegal for the sake of argument, he was still a toxic boss drunk on power. And moreover, multiple people in the documentary, from both cast and particularly staff writers, in the documentary state his actual work contributions were negligible. That no, he wasn't the genius holding Nickelodeon together for 20 years since 2000. That he was a figurehead, that he didn't actually do anything. And this is a widespread problem throughout the industry of people outright saying, no, that guy couldn't be that incompetent. And we're trying to say they failed upwards and they're a figurehead, and the allegations that no, they're really geniuses, that's just a PR campaign. That a big part of this was people going, he wasn't, not only was he a toxic boss, he contributed very little. That myth of, well, he's this unstable, but he's a genius, that makes up for it. No, he's not. He's just plain a jackass. That the people saying his only contribution was dirty jokes, inappropriate for that age group, which at best would have gone over kids' heads, and at worst just wasn't funny. That one actor, I made a separate review podcast on this, it was so impactful, but I'll link that, but when one of the actors says in the finale, episode 5, the follow-up episode, the quote, this cutting quote, if you take away all of his dirty jokes, that's all Dan did. There would have been nothing left but commercials. Just, that's what the show was. There wasn't even anything else except things other people contributed, which the writers or the cast members themselves and the other writing staff, that we can't think of other things he actually contributed. But, as always with that situation of corrupt bosses in a corrupt system, they just take credit for everything. And again, moving on to the system, it wasn't even all Dan Schneider, because a lot of this is stuff he wasn't directly responsible for, but about Nickelodeon as a whole and about the industry as a whole. Again, watch my full review, but where they go, Dan wasn't directly responsible for this, but like, you're supposed to have child actors chaperoned by an adult, preferably their parent, every second. And just these multiple accounts of saying they just let child actors wander around the studio lot without chaperones, even though they are specifically legally required to. And that isn't a failing of just Dan Schneider, but every adult who worked on, the hundreds of people working on that lot, knew and just did the rule. They don't need new rules. There are rules in place. They're simply not being enforced. This is bigger than the failings of one man. Or even the worst thing, which they really point out, is after Drake Bell's abuser was legally convicted as a sex offender for using him on Nickelodeon, the same man went over and got hired on another children's show over on Disney. This man was a registered sex offender. He's in a registry. And no one at Disney bothered to do a basic background check for people working on a children's show. This is bigger than one man, this is bigger than one company, of just how lax they were in their own rules at best, and at worst, there's no oversight for Dan Schneider was really incompetent, and on top of that was just this toxic boss. And the parts where he is pranking cast members and they're clearly uncomfortable, pranking them on video clips that he would publicly post to their website. And that was a big thing. They make a follow-up episode. There were 4 original episodes and a follow-up one. And a lot of it was them going, why didn't the media report on this at the time? The insult that it's not like this was a secret. Everyone knew what Dan was, but the media liked having... This happens with so many celebrity things. Yes, it applies to David Benioff, but to so many others as well, of the media knows, but it's money to keep reporting on him. So we're not going to point out that his public behavior on a publicly released video where he is pranking child actors and they're visibly upset, no one reported on that. Or Drake Bell saying, why didn't the media report on my trial against my abuser, even to call me a liar? They didn't report anything because it's not news to them. It doesn't generate money. That they don't touch on it that much in the documentary, but the tacit thing is the media failed to report on this as the watchdog, that the social gadfly that could have reported on all of these things at any time. It's not like secret stuff Dan Schneider or Nickelodeon were doing in private. A lot of this was in public. And it's the moral cowardice and the failure of the journalism not to. But I've made a whole separate video on that. But that was really impactful. And not just because it's a good documentary, like Firefest was a good documentary. This started out as a fan movement on YouTube and TikTok. I mean, that went viral. And in the lead up to its release, I went back and watched like 2-year-old videos, long form 2-hour documentaries on like, We Don't Talk About Dan Schneider was one of them. This is a really good fan made documentary presenting, because it's all public clips. So on a wider level, quiet on set, the documentary gave me a big boost in morale of all the things we're trying to show that are wrong at what happened to Game of Thrones or what happened behind the scenes with Star Wars, that yes, it might take years, but fan campaigns can let light come on to the truth. So hang in there, I guess. But no, this was a success story that we needed. And that's my conclusion to my whole rambling podcast here. I know I've reached the hour length now. I thought I'd go an hour and a half. Thankfully, it's 1 hour. Again, this was the long-form podcast to accompany my more succinct awards video. This is almost a live stream. That my conclusion here, thinking of the Quiet on Set documentary, which reminded me a lot of things from I've already made videos on Maureen Ryan's Burn It Down book that came out last year, talking about corruption in the industry, like how terrible the Lost Writers Room was, all these things. All of this fits a wider pattern. I'm trying to step back and look at the wider pattern of industry corruption, which ties into that. A lot of the story of this year was aftermath of the once in a decade writers' strike, which when paired with the Screen Actors Guild almost never goes on strike. The last time they went on strike was 1980. So we had this double strike of the writers and actors guilds. Hasn't happened in over 30 years. This is a decade scale, hopefully sea change in the industry, because the writers and actors have lost every strike since 1980. This is the 2007 strike they lost, and I seriously think, reading Maureen Ryan's book, going over my own stuff, a major theme we'll see, because that's also when Game of Thrones got really corrupt, was after 2007 they hired these people, that just how crazy and unhinged this new Gilded Age behind the scenes was, of these studio execs who refused to believe that the streamers are going to come and kick their ass. One. Even though the whole reason the strike happened is we're worried that Netflix and streaming and binge model will destroy the old regime. Not only did the old regime ignore these warnings, only to get crushed by, like, 2019. They also felt they were invincible because they had won a strike against the writers, so they got even more corrupt. That they would. The big thing with the strike was the mini rooms, which is a glorified way of saying, we don't need 10 writers as a full writer's room. We can just hire 3 people. We'll call it a mini room. And that's not enough writers to run a TV show. That just, they were cutting corners everywhere. That winning that strike emboldened them to make even more drastic cuts at a time when the strike was right. That you should have been worried about Netflix coming, and it destroyed all of them. I mean, how many of these things, like the old HBO, got bought out by other companies, eventually got bought out by Discovery, of just the willful blindness of the 2000s, particularly the 2010s. So Dan Snyder was really a symptom of a wider pattern of just how corrupt everyone got in the context of, this is why we needed these strikes, to have checks and balances of either abuse or just plain efficiency, of you need more writers in this. You can't have one super showrunner who answers to no one. Look what Dan Snyder turned into, or look at the faith they put in Joss Whedon. That you need a system, that there was system-wide corruption. So that came up in Quiet on Set, came up in Maureen Ryan's great book, which I've reported on before. I've been reading I read the lost parts. I've been reading the rest of it. I'm going to make more videos about it since Christmas break. That the message of 2024 in the aftermath of the strikes was, those are the reasons the strike happened, was all of that corruption behind the scenes, which in some cases they are starting to grow back from, that Marvel has instituted reforms behind the scenes. And we have to know that going forward, of that what happens on the industry level affects why TV shows happen. I mean, I don't consider myself unusual, but I've been told, wow, you actually research what industry things led to shows failing. Turns out most other channels, because everyone can make a channel, are, this Star Wars project was bad. The writer must personally hate me. Versus, no, the two writers were arguing with each other, or maybe they wanted money, or they were trying to maybe appeal to a new demographic, or maybe they were trying to ride the coattails of some other thing, like when they said, let's make a Suicide Squad video game, when that really wasn't a good video game. Like, there are industry reasons that things happen. It's not this campaign that they hate you. The woke culture hates me. It's more simple than that. Usually incompetence, but you have to follow what is actually happening behind the scenes on an industry level of, why did Marvel TV shows fail so badly, culminating in Secret Invasion. And I've made videos about that with the Agatha stuff and leading into Daredevil of, well, we didn't appoint showrunners, we just saw them as supplements to the movies, we really needed to reform that and have their own showrunners, and that is why it's better now, not just because. So we've seen recovery from the failures of the past decade, with, now that the strikes got rights for writers. I think most of the shows this year were written before the strike, if you think about it, or animated projects that take even longer to make. Like Penguin had to go on pause because of the strikes, because they filmed in New York City. It'll be interesting, because the ripple effects take a long time. What will TV shows be like in 2025 that were written after the strike, after the Writers Guild got concessions like, you need to have a minimum number of writers per show, otherwise it'll be bad, that you need to have paid training, you need to have paid rewrites. How much will this, we're in a transitional period now, how much will this affect the shows that are coming in 2025 when we see the fruits of the strike really kicking in, that we've only just begun to see towards the end of the year with, like, Agatha All Along? And also the other big thing of this year was, like, indie animated projects like Amazing Digital Circus or Hazbin Hotel, Hell of a Boss universe, that these were not part of the studio system at all, but rose up due to good writing. But a lot of that was felt in the first half of the year, that by fall, I really felt that the worst of these past issues was over. Like House of the Dragon Season 2 obviously was the last big one affected by everything, but Rings of Power Season 2 is an improvement. Penguin was a great hit, and then Dune Prophecy was better than I thought it would be, so maybe we have started to turn a page. There will always be exceptions, but maybe we have started to turn a page on fixing the behind-the-scenes corruption, which is why we had the strikes last year. because it was affecting TV quality. One thing I can say about the coming years will be the era of mega mergers. They've openly said now that the merger-friendly government is in place that, like, Paramount's probably going to get bought out by someone else. Warner Discovery will probably absorb something else. They were saving money to buy Paramount or something. Maybe they'll increase their episode counts again now that they're doing better. I'm going to make a separate video on state of the industry for Warner, because there were a lot of announcements the past 2 months. But that's how things stand at the end of 2024. I know this is a long rambling thing of just the journey we went on in the wake of the strikes. But we won the last strikes. The writers won them. And this will hopefully bring in better quality for shows coming out 2025 through 2026 and onward. But for that, join me after the jump in my sequel podcast to this, in which I go over the top most anticipated shows of the coming year, 2025.